Ready to start? Firstly, before I jump into everything, how's everybody doing? Good? Fantastic. So I'll be giving a brief talk today, talking about how you can build applications using Google's AI tools. So before I start, could I get a quick show of hands who have seen the webinar that we sent out a few weeks back? Okay, great. I will not be reiterating everything I went through, just for the sake of time, and you've already seen it. But what I'll do is first, I'll just give a brief introduction to myself and a bit about my story of how I got to Google. And then I'll just touch on a few pro tips for using Google AI Studio, stuff you won't find in the documentation, but it can still be quite useful for prototyping and building apps. So first, I'll explain what I do at Google. So I'm a startup architect in the early stage startup team. And essentially what that means is I have the pleasure of supporting our early stage startups adopt Google Cloud products and services. So one thing we do is we give our startups a bunch of credits, sometimes up to $350,000 in credits. And so our job is to help them understand how they can leverage Google's technology so they're not reinventing the wheel and they can move faster and ultimately be successful. But a bit about me. I have a few pictures here to try and illustrate a bit of my journey. It's a bit biased. You can see a lot of Google, but I'll kind of get into why that is. So I'll kind of start off with university. So I went to the University of Warwick. Is there any University of Warwick students here? No? Okay. But yeah, I studied computer science. I did a bachelor's. I graduated in 2023. So I've been at Google about 2 years now. But during my time at university, I was fortunate enough to do 2 internships here at Google. So I worked as a software engineer in a site reliability engineering team. If you haven't heard of site reliability engineering, or it's something you want to learn a bit more about, feel free to ask a question after this talk. But if you want to find me afterwards, then you can as well. So after those 2 internships, I was fortunate enough to get a conversion offer to come back as a software engineer. But unfortunately, this was during the massive tech layoffs. And because of that, I wasn't able to come back as a software engineer. And at that point, my whole life, all I wanted to be was a software engineer. So it was a point where, I graduated uni, I was unemployed. I didn't know what the next step was. But again, I was very fortunate enough when my recruiter reached out and told me about a program called the Cloud Technical Residency Program. Essentially what that was a kind of like a grad scheme. You would join for 9 months, you would do training for free, and then 2 rotations in different teams for 3 months. And that was in Google Cloud. So I got to do a rotation in the corporate part of the business, which is companies that do about 100 million plus in revenue, but also in the digital natives team, which is your more modern companies who have been founded in the last 20 years or so. And that was a fantastic experience because I hadn't been in a customer-facing role before. So it allowed me to develop a lot. Even standing in front of you today, this was something I wasn't able to do when I was a software engineer. So it was a kind of a leap of faith, taking something a bit different, but really happy I did it in the end. One thing I forgot to mention as well, I was the co-founder of a startup during university. It was a student networking platform, but I'm here today, so you can probably tell it didn't go to plan. But the key thing I want to kind of take away from that is, especially when I was young, you always kind of set out this plan, exactly what you want to do, where you want to be. Things don't always go to plan, but things do always work out. And if you do have any questions about my journey, if you're passionate about startups and are thinking of starting something, looking for internships in the tech industry and want to understand what process I took or just ask for any kind of like what my story was and how I prepared for them, then I'll be around for the rest of the day. So feel free to find me and pull me aside for a chat. But you can also ask questions after this session. So now I'll kind of talk about the AI side of things and how you can build applications on Google. So from the webinar, you would have probably seen that we have a product called Google AI Studio. Now, Google AI Studio is a web-based platform. It allows you to very quickly test and prototype some of our newest models. You would have probably seen that we released some image generation models recently, and they will all be on the Google AI Studio. But one thing that we added to Google AI Studio is the ability to build applications. So you would have seen a brief bit about that. I'll quickly play this video just in the background so you can kind of see a very kind of quick example of how this product works. But you essentially use some natural language. It will generate an application for you, and then you can use a chat interface to make amends and make changes to that. And one of the really cool things about Google AI Studio is the integration it has to Google Cloud. And so if you prototype and build something, for example, at hackathons, it can be really, really useful. You can then push that to Google Cloud and share it with other people. So it's not something that has to live directly on your laptop. It can be pushed to the cloud very easily. So I'll skip past this because not much is happening. But I kind of want to go a few pro tips for using Google AI Studio. As I said previously, this is kind of the stuff you won't see in documentation. And for most of these things, they can be used outside of Google Cloud as well. So if you are a fan of the vibe coding kind of movement and using AI to build stuff, then some of this will be relevant even if you're not using Google Cloud tools. So this one is specific to Google AI Studio, and that's all around persistent version control. Could I just get a quick show of hands who is familiar with the term version control? Okay, so for those of you that don't know, whenever you're coding or even if you're writing a Word document, you're constantly making changes. And sometimes it's very useful where you want to make a change that may break everything, but you want to be able to do it in confidence and have a checkpoint that you can refer back to if things go really wrong. And essentially that's what version control is. And if any of you have used any of these AI tools, things do go wrong, and so it's really important to have that. So we do have that built into the application, but one of the limitations that we have is that chat history is local to your session, and so if you refresh the page or leave the page, that chat history is gone, and therefore you lose that checkpoint. And so one best practice that we recommend is that you should continuously make copies alongside those version controls. So one thing you can do here is you can save a copy of your application. And so whenever you want to make a breaking change or something that could potentially go wrong, we recommend just hit that button, make a new save, maybe do a dash in the version number so you can keep track of it and go back if you need to. One extra tip as well, although some people may view this as a limitation, you can actually use it as a superpower. You could have 10 windows open if you want, and they're all going to be independent from one another. So if there's a lot of things that you want to try out or run a bunch of experiments at the same time, you can do that in 10 different windows, and they'll all be independent from one another. So that can speed up a lot of time if you're trying to iterate an experiment. The second kind of tip I want to give is with prompting. Now, I could probably give a whole hour talk on prompting because it can get really, really deep. But I think the main thing I wanted to focus on is this point here. If you don't specify something, then Gemini has to take a guess. And in some cases, it makes very good guesses or teaches you something you didn't know. But a lot of the times, it can lead to doing something that you didn't want it to do. All right? You could have had an idea for how you wanted user interface to look, and it took a completely different approach. Or you may have wanted to use a certain library or language, and it used a different one. And so the key thing is that you should always give as much context and information as possible. And one way that I like to do that is with planning documents or project briefs. So this is something that's baked into Google's engineering culture. We have a concept called design documents, which essentially is what allows us to scale as a company and have so many engineers. But the key goal is that you should be able to create a document that has all of the relevant information, so you can give that to somebody completely different, and they should be able to build something that you have in your head. And so I think it's something that can transfer very well to AI tools, which is you can very easily create a Google document. There's an example here where you're just basically listing out exactly what you want the application to do, how you want the flow, how you want it to function. And because of that, it should eliminate any guesswork for the models. And so therefore, it's more likely to build something that you're actually happy with. One extra tip, and this is something that's mostly unique to Gemini, we really lean towards the multimodal capabilities of Gemini. For those of you that don't know what that means, essentially Gemini can take in data of any format. So you can put videos into Gemini, images, text, audio. One interesting use case we see is people take football matches and they ask for highlights. So they'll be like, give me all of the timestamps of goals or give me all the fouls. And so because of that, when you're writing this document, you can include images. So if there's applications that you already know that function very well, or there's specific features that you want to steal and put into your own applications, you could provide a video of a user flow. You could provide an image or like a Figma board, for example, or even PDFs. So that's just something that you should utilize within contexting as well to make sure that you get something that looks like you want it to. The third tip is all around asking Gemini not to overdo it. One thing that will happen is when you use these AI tools, oftentimes they do way too much stuff. You probably will be like, okay, I want you to center this div or move this element to another page, and then you realize a bunch of other stuff on other pages is broken as well. And so one of the things we recommend is this kind of links to prompting, where you can use prompting to ensure, you can say things like, keep everything else the same. Don't change any of the other elements. But another tip you can do is, as your applications gets bigger and bigger, the models get more and more confused, and a lot of these things can start to happen. And so one thing that we recommend is use these LLMs to prototype and build an early version of the product. But once you get to a point where you're happy, and you want to start making minor changes, you should actually do those code changes yourself. And a good way to do that is kind of put the model into this, sometimes you can call it like pair programming, where you just ask the model, explain to me how this happens, or give me some recommendations on how I could achieve X. And then from that advice, you can then implement it yourself. And then that way you get a lot more control. You don't have to obviously be worrying about whether the model's going to mess up anything, and you can just implement it yourself. So that's something that we recommend. As the project gets larger, it can be quite difficult to get the model to do what you want it to do. There's a few bonus tips here as well. Sorry, this slide isn't as beautiful as the other ones. But the first thing is structured output. So structured output is something that is super important, and I don't think enough people use it. A lot of the times, you don't need the model to be able to write paragraphs upon paragraphs. You're asking it to do a very simple task, and structured output can help with that, where essentially you can fix the output of the model to a very specific schema. So you could imagine if you're asking Gemini to generate you recipes. Every recipe has a certain structure. You have ingredients, you have the step-by-step instructions, and maybe you have some information around how many calories is this meal. That's where you can use structured output, and essentially just makes the models a lot more reliable. So we definitely recommend you using that. Another thing you can do with that as well is playing around with the model parameters. So a lot of you would have probably seen a parameter called temperature. Hands up if you know what I mean when I say temperature in relation to LLMs. Okay, so most people know what it is, but for those of you that don't, I won't go too deep on the technical side, but essentially LLMs are probabilistic, and because of that, you can get very random results. You could put a prompt in one day, and then the next day, it spits out a bunch of garbage. And so the temperature setting is a really good way to control that. So as the temperature gets lower, the model will act more deterministically. Not fully, but it will just give you more reliable and consistent results. And so if you're doing something like structured output, you don't really need the model to be as creative, right? You just need it to do its job and give you repeatable results. And that's why we recommend put the temperature quite low, maybe like 0.1, play around with it. The other thing is debugging. So oftentimes, again, things may not always go right the first time around, but what you can do is prompt Gemini to console.log as much as possible so that you can actually see what is happening in your application. And so this is something that probably every programmer has done before, where you have an issue and you put about 100 print commands in your code to try and find the root cause of the issue. So something that you should also implement within this vibe coding as well. The last one here at the bottom is just decomposing your application into smaller files. So that again, as the application gets bigger, the models tend to struggle with implementing things. So we recommend, again, it's very similar to software engineering principles. You should split logic into separate files, and then that way you can specifically focus on one file, and then that way you don't have to worry about it merging with different code or finding conflicts. So that's everything I wanted to talk about in terms of building applications with AI. Again, if you haven't seen the webinar, I'll go in a lot more detail about how you can actually use these tools. But now I wanted to give the floor in case anyone had any questions about anything Google related, anything my personal life related in terms of career, anything like that. But I'll be around afterwards if you don't feel comfortable asking now. From there.
Then why did your startup fail?
There's a few reasons. I think number one, being a student and being a founder, in my opinion, in hindsight, is not a good idea. Being a student is very hard. You probably all know that. And building a tech company is even harder. And trying to balance them both at the same time, you probably are setting yourself up for failure. At the time, I was the only technical founder, so there was a lot of responsibility on my back. I spent every day building this application, and I didn't have any support. I didn't have anybody that could help me out or balance the load with me. And especially early on, the product is sometimes the most important part. So I think just burnout was a massive factor. I think the second thing as well is really important to know who you're building a business with. I think a lot of people use this as an analogy, but I think it's spot on. A founder is like being in a marriage, right? This is someone you're spending more time with than anybody else in a very stressful environment. If you don't get on well, then the business will fail. I think in my case, we're at a point where we were too different in terms of I was very technical and they were very business focused. And so sometimes, it's very hard to understand the work that each other is doing. A non-technical person might think something's very easy to implement, but it's very difficult. So I think in hindsight, that was another thing as well, just spending more time to build that relationship beforehand. So I'd say those are the two main points. Nice, thanks for the question. Any other questions? There's one here and one here.
Thanks. You mentioned that there are a couple of different Google AI things that you can build on with different levels of coding and stuff. How easy is it to switch between one and another? So if you start on the AI studio and then you're like, okay, no, I need a bit more specificity, can you then quite easily switch into the next level up, or is that difficult?
I would say it's not difficult, but it's not super, super convenient. One thing that we've we have, I think the two main ones would be Firebase Studio and then AI Studio. Moving between either or is not like a simple hit one button, export the project, but you can obviously download the code, put that into whatever platform. So if it's, you're using AI Studio and now you want to use a local IDE, then obviously you can download the files, create a project. But one thing with AI Studio is you can create a Git repo out of it. And so you have that flexibility. Once it's in a Git repo, you can import that repo into many different tools. Another thing as well is the Gemini API. So the Google AI Studio is not an enterprise-ready product. So it's not something that I work on specifically. We have Vertex AI for that. Vertex AI has a similar product called Vertex AI Studio. It just doesn't do the app building part. It's mainly focused on testing the newer models. But the SDK that you use makes it very easy for you to switch which endpoint. So if you are building an application and then start running into things where you get users and you need a bit more scalability, or you need more compliance and control over where data is being processed, it's literally just in the constructor to the client. You provide an extra kind of flag, and then it will switch to the Vertex AI endpoint. So at least in that part, it's a very easy migration over to Vertex AI. Perfect. Did you still have a question?
I was just going to ask, because I'm not a very technical person, but what do you love about your job?
I think this is one thing I've always said about Google, even when I was an engineer. It's definitely the people. Google is a place that has some of the most amazing people you could imagine. There's people from all different backgrounds. Not everybody has that classic computer science into technology kind of route. And everyone's unique. Everyone has their own things that make them special. But there's super smart people here, and there's so many opportunities to learn from people. As a young person, it's a fantastic environment to be in. I think another thing as well is around just the level of autonomy you have in the company. So even if you're young, you're not held back. I'm technically the lowest level you can be in my role. Yet I'm able to do work that people who have been here 10, 15 years are able to do. So I think that's another element that's really useful as well. I think there was a question there.
How do you keep up with the rate of technological change? So in your own job, how do you make sure you don't feel overwhelmed? Because everything is moving so fast.
So I definitely haven't solved that yet. So it's not like I'm up to date with everything. Especially in Google, it's very difficult because there's so many different teams building different products. I think one thing that really helps me is just really being present in the industry and being curious. So newsletters is a fantastic way to do that. I think you'll find a lot of people who have their own ideas, especially in this industry. There's no right answers. There's no blueprint. Nobody should be telling you how to build an application. Especially with agents and stuff, it's all opinionated based. We do not have the proof. So I think try and listen to as many voices as you can. Just because someone has a lot of followers or just because somebody's working at Google, like myself, it doesn't mean we're right. So definitely listen to people, be critical and think for yourself whether you align or are interested by what they're saying, and just take on as much on board as possible, I would say is at least what I try and do. But yeah, it's difficult.
Hi there. I was just going to ask, do you feel Google's mission has shifted where there's multiple competitors now, like GPT-5, for example? Do you feel like Google's mission now is to provide the best version of AI and lead that market?
I think it's difficult for me to say. I at least can give my opinion on kind of how I see my job and the conversations I have with customers. But one thing is we've always been an AI company, and we invented the transformer architecture, which has gone on to build a lot of the large language models that you use today. So it's always been something that we've had a big priority on. I just think it's there's more demand on the customer facing side, where a lot more people are now starting to think that AI has to be a massive part of the business, and so there is definitely more of a pressure. And I think what you will see over the last 3 months and going forward is just that we're releasing things a lot quicker. I think especially when we look at when the Gemini models first came out and things like that, the rate at which things were coming out were not as fast as they could have been. I think now you will kind of see we're shipping new stuff all the time. Similar to your question, it makes it very hard for me. But I think at least that's what something I've seen change is that we just have to listen to customers' feedback a lot more and get things shipped out as quickly as possible. Any other questions? Oh, is that time? Sorry. Well, I'll be around anyway, so if you have any questions, feel free to just pull me to the side. More than happy to answer anything. Thank you.